Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom, when we think about some ideas that make up cultural, religious, philosophical kind of conundrums, etc., cruxes of our time. This week, we've been looking at memories we don't have. And just a quick review, I talked about nostalgia, how actually personal nostalgia has been shown to be a very positive kind of psychological thing to do, but that cultural nostalgia is a very different thing and is often used as propaganda tools for particular political ends that are not always the best kind of political ends. Nostalgia can be used to activate certain kinds of ideas that then can be used by leaders who want to use those. So memories we don't have. Yesterday, I started talking about history, and history in its many forms, actually, through time, all the way from pictures of pharaohs to today, with we still put up monuments, etc. So how do we remember what we don't remember is the question. And yesterday I did mention the really founder of history as we know it today, Thucydides, the 400s BCE, who was an Athenian general in the war that he talked about, the Peloponnesian War, and also a historian. And he says this in the introduction to his book: "Assuredly, my conclusions will not be disturbed either by the lays, the songs of a poet displaying the exaggeration of his craft, or by the compositions of the chroniclers that are attractive at truth's expense." So, yeah, poets would, Homer, etc., would build up these things and make them suddenly fictionalized. Chroniclers, such as I mentioned yesterday, the Hebrew writers who were writing about the monarchies that were going on among the Hebrew people, these were specifically designed to not be realistic, to push very specific political, social ends and religious ends. Thucydides is not going to do that. He's going to treat history, as he called it, as philosophy in action. We're going to philosophize out of what happened. So we got to get what happened as close as we can to that. But of course, we always have to remember a good African proverb: until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. So yes, the history is written by the winners, usually, and so we do have to remember that. And then, of course, we have to remember the warning from George Orwell's 1984. We hear about 1984 a lot, but studies have indicated not a lot of people have actually read it. In the book, Orwell writes this: "Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." And that is the victory of Big Brother and the idea of what might happen in the future, according to Orwell. Orwell is in the statue, and this inscription is in front of Broadcast House, the BBC headquarters in London. And the inscription, a little hard to read, but it says, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." So there you go. And Orwell did a good bit of that in his own lifetime. Now, let's look at another phenomenon that we've been dealing with a lot lately in US social connections. Historical, and it's called a lot of different things. It can be negationism. Sometimes it's called historical revisionism, revisionist history. That's the distortion of the historical record such that certain events appear to have occurred and or impacted history in a way that is in drastic disagreement with the historical record and or consensus, and usually meant to advance, well, something like I mentioned yesterday. One of the most famous instances in the US and an ongoing struggle in US social life is what did the American Civil War mean? Media after the war in 1866, a newspaper editor who lived through the war in the South from Virginia, Edward Pollard, wrote The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates, drawn from official sources and approved by the most distinguished Confederate leaders. In that book, he argues that there were two nations of opposite civilizations. And of course, guess which one he liked the best, being a Southerner. And again, this painting is kind of summarizes the lost cause idea that begins to permeate Southern thinking. The good old flag there being rolled up, sadly, because they just can't go on fighting anymore. So this is the lost cause, and it's a way of reinterpreting history that has impact all the way down to today, as I discussed yesterday. I want to take another look at something that's also going on right now, and that is looking back at certain books that people are finding dangerous, perhaps. This is an online blurb for a book called Debunking Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America by Mary Graeber. Fake history, fake news, you get the connection. The blurb says this: Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States has sold more than 2.5 million copies. It is pushed by Hollywood celebrities, defended by university professors who know better, and assigned in high school and college classrooms to teach students that American history is nothing more than a litany of oppression, slavery, and exploitation. Zinn's history is popular, but it is also massively wrong. Scholar Mary Graeber exposes just how wrong in her stunning new book, Debunking Howard Zinn, which demolishes Zinn's Marxist talking points that now dominate American education. So you see how this is going to work. But I should mention that Mary Graeber was hard at work working on a history panel for the Trump administration just before that ended. Let's look a little bit more at the blurb here. In Debunking Howard Zinn, you'll learn contra Zinn, how Columbus was not a genocidal maniac and was, in fact, a defender of Indians. Now, again, we have to look for the inflammatory language here, genocidal maniac. Why the American Indians were not feminist, communist, sexual revolutionaries ahead of their time. How the United States was founded to protect liberty, not white males' ill-gotten wealth. Why Americans of the greatest generation were not the equivalent of Nazi war criminals. How the Viet Cong were not well-meaning community leaders advocating for local self-rule. Why the Black Panthers were not civil rights leaders. Graeber also reveals Zinn's bag of dishonest rhetorical tricks, his slavish reliance on partisan history, explicit rejection of historical balance, and selective quotation of sources to make them say the exact opposite of what their authors intended. If you care about America's past and our future, you need this book. All right, are you sold yet? I should mention that Mary Graeber was born in Slovenia when it was still part of communist Yugoslavia. Again, this is a blurb from her website, and she grew up in Rochester, New York. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Georgia in 2002 and taught at a number of colleges and universities in 2013. Now, I will quickly tell you that I also have a PhD in English. Yeah, I love history, but I don't pretend to write scholarly history because that's not my training. Back to the blurb. While teaching, she wrote widely on political, cultural, and educational topics and founded the Dissident Prof Education Project, a nonprofit reform initiative. All right. In 2014, she moved to Clinton, New York, and became a resident fellow at the Ding Ding Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. Yeah, because of the musical, we like Alexander Hamilton these days. He's got pretty good press. We do forget that he was a particular kind of father of our nation that did not set up some things that we probably really are proud of in the U.S. today. So we should look at a moment at Howard Zinn, 1922 to 2010. He was an American historian, playwright, philosopher, and socialist thinker. He was chair of history and social sciences department at Spelman College and a political science professor at Boston University. So he didn't have a PhD in English, and he did teach at prestigious universities. in other words, parenthetically. He once said, I am something of an anarchist, something of a socialist, maybe a democratic socialist. And as the blurb mentions, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is a bestseller, has been for years, and has become very much a backbone of much history that is taught. Now, I should mention that one thing about that mentions, the greatest generation were not like Nazi war criminals. All right, well, Zinn actually was from the greatest generation, and he did participate in the war. He was a secular Jewish fellow and eager to fight fascists, then joined the U.S. Army Air Corps. Sorry, that's misspelled there, becoming a bombardier, bombing targets in Berlin, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. As a bombardier, Zinn dropped napalm bombs in April 1945 on Rouen, a seaside resort in Western France. Probably not one of the hottest military targets going during the end of the Second World War. On the bombing of Pilsen, Zinn writes this: we did not aim specifically at the Skoda works. This has always been very much, since the war, a discussion is what were the Americans bombing in the city of Pilsen. The Skoda works were a legitimate military target. The city itself was not. So we weren't aiming at the Skoda works, which I would have noted because it was the one target in Czechoslovakia I had read about, but dropped our bombs without much precision on the city of Pilsen. Two Czech citizens who lived in Pilsen at the time told me recently that several hundred people were killed in that raid. So he does have some knowledge of what was going on at the end of the Second World War, and there was quite a bit of bombing going on after the German Air Force ceased to exist. Well, here's what Howard Zinn had to say. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of our country, presented as the history of a family, conceals the fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such as world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. So he's going to specifically use a metaphor not of the American family and the history of the American family, but a different kind of look. He also says to emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. So this is how he's talking about Christopher Columbus, not quite as in explosive as terms as the book blurb is mentioning. I should mention that you can easily look up what Christopher Columbus was talking about. His writings are online. When Columbus got back in 1493, he wrote a letter to his sponsors, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and it says this: on the 33rd day of leaving Cadiz, I came into the Indian Ocean, where I discovered many islands inhabited by numerous people. I took possession of all of them for our most fortunate king by making public proclamation and unfurling his standard, no one making any resistance. The inhabitants are all, as I said before, unprovided with any sort of iron, and they are destitute of arms, which are entirely unknown to them, and for which they are not adapted, not on account of any bodily deformity, for they are well made, but because they are timid and full of terror. I should mention there is an illustration here, and we nowadays use the term grilling as a metaphor for a tough interrogation. Europeans in the invasion period meant grilling, they were grilling, and this is an illustration of a Tiano native being grilled to find out where the gold was. They must be hiding it. Well, of course, you may know the end of that story. The Tiano had no gold in the part of the Caribbean where they were. But when they see that they are safe, Columbus goes on, and all fear is banished, they are very guileless and honest and very liberal of all they have. No one refuses the asker anything that he possesses. On the contrary, they themselves invite us to ask for it. They manifest the greatest affection toward all of us, exchanging valuable things for trifles, content with the very least thing or nothing at all. Let's think for a moment who's doing what to whom here, right? He goes on. I gave them many beautiful and pleasing things which I had brought with me for no return whatever, in order to win their affection, and that they might become Christians and inclined to love our king and queen and princes and all the people of Spain, and that they might be eager to search for and gather and give to us what they abound in and we greatly need. Their highnesses may see that I shall give them as much gold as they need, and slaves as many as they shall order to be shipped. Pretty clearly in this particular introductory letter to the voyage, to his sponsors, Columbus is indeed saying that the people can be enslaved, etc. And indeed, he brought back captives from the first voyage and brought back slaves thereafter. So yeah, the historical record is actually there and we can look at it. Not too difficult. You may have, you who go to First Unitarian Society have gone to a lecture. It was an evening lecture a couple of years ago now by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who has written a series of books, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, also one for young people, and quite the historian. And again, the kind of historian who is actually asking people what they think about what's going on. The great founder of this kind of writing, of course, is Studs Terkel. His Chicago became very famous in the 70s and 80s. He wrote some great books, Hard Times, An Oral History of the Great Depression. So he goes out and asks people about how they lived the Great Depression. And his greatest book, probably, Working, people talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. It's an absolutely fascinating book. And Mr. Terkel was actually asking people what they thought about these things. As a matter of fact, his way of writing, he said, don't be an examiner, be an interested inquirer. Actually ask people. What a concept. I have to throw this one in. I hope for peace and sanity. It's the same thing, he wrote. Well, thanks so much for joining in this week. I hope I gave you something to think about in terms of how we remember things, what nostalgia does to in social life, how history can be told several different ways. Our theme this month for Black History Month at First Unitarian Society is Beloved Community. Sunday, 10:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. Our subject will be the challenge of beloved community. Rev. Jim Foldy will be speaking, as will FUS board member Amanda Harrington. Next week on Coffee and Wisdom, I'll be talking about the God's Eye View. We'll see what that's all about. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.